Good afternoon, everyone. I am Leslie Garvin, the Executive Director of North Carolina Campus Engagement. As I just said, we are recording this session, but as a reminder, closed captioning is available. You'll just need to navigate to the Zoom toolbar and click Show Captions. And we are going to reserve time at the end for question and answer, but obviously if you have questions along the way and you want to remember them, we encourage you to enter them in the Q&A box, and we'll reserve the chat for comments and responses. And we are just so excited that you're joining us today. This is another session of our virtual dialogue series. We started it in 2020. It's a way for us to introduce our 38 member campuses to various dialogue methods, formats, approaches, and even ideas and discussions on related topics. So we're especially excited today to have with us the Constructive Dialogue Institute. We have our speaker, but we also have with us Courtney Bradshaw Clay, who is the Partnerships Director, and I do want to acknowledge her. She helped work with me to arrange our time together. So many of you are probably already familiar with the Constructive Dialogue Institute. You may have even gotten an email this week. They have been doing a lot of research over the last few years, examining free speech and inclusion on college campuses. And so we are so pleased to have with us Jake Fay, who is going to discuss the foundations of constructive dialogue as a solution to the pedagogical challenge of dialogue in the classroom. Jake is an educator with years of experience teaching and thinking about civic discourse. He most recently was a fellow at the University of California's National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. He was in the class of 21-22, and I just completed my term as a fellow in the class of 22-23. He's also an institutional fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, where he headed up the Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership. He's taught at Bowdoin College, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Harvard College. He holds an ED, EDD, and EDM from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, an MA in American History from Brandeis, and is a proud graduate of the Shady Hill Teacher Training course. He is a co-editor both with Mira Levinson of Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, Cases and Commentaries, and Democratic Discord in School, Cases and Commentaries in Educational Ethics. Jake, that's a lot. We are so grateful that you are here and bringing all your knowledge and expertise. So everyone, join me in welcoming Jake Fay.
Thank you so much. I forgot that that's the bio that I had written myself. I usually just like to introduce myself as someone who's been working in this space for a little bit of time. I started, as Leslie noted, at Harvard through an ethics center there, working this cross-institutional partnership. And one thing led to another, and a position opened up at CDI where I could do that work at really a bigger scale and get to work with people all across the country. And so that's really what led me out of academia into the nonprofit space. Because this work is really close, it's near and dear to my heart. I really enjoy it. And I hope that I can pass along a little bit of that enthusiasm to you today. So the talk I'm going to give today is, I call it Why Dialogue. And it's not all a talk. Don't worry, we're going to do some things to try to make things a little interactive. And I do realize we have some teams of people here today. So is really going to stretch my ability to use our Zoom breakout rooms. So we have people that are in groups doing things in real life and people that are in groups in Zoom space. So we'll see how all that goes. But we're gonna talk about why dialogue, an argument for and an introduction to constructive dialogue today. So before we get rolling, I want everyone to take a second and think about this question. What challenges related to civic education and dialogue on campus or in the classroom are front of mind for you? And I'd love to have some people share in the chat. So those individuals that are representing groups or teams from campuses, if you got people shouting things out, just put them into chat and I'll kind of read out a couple of them to share them out for everybody. What challenges related to civic education and dialogue on campus or in the classroom are front of mind for you? Lack of positive, effective examples to show in our current political landscape. Facilitation skills, polarization of political, polarization's everywhere. We're going to talk about that for a little bit. Creating a safe environment. Navigating polarization, priority making, free speech and intention with inclusivity. That one's getting a thumbs up. A lot of these things come out in every talk that we give. These same set of concerns are coming up. So again, just to make sure private colleges in the Constitution, different process than at state schools. Yeah, so we hear these things from institutions, individuals all around the country. The same set of challenges everywhere. There's this sort of broad ecology of polarized society, of polarized politics. How do we go about having discussions that and learning that is going on in college campuses that isn't completely overrun by some of the challenges related to political polarization? So these are all things that are certainly in front of mind, difficult questions to be wrestling with. And you know, I can't promise that anything we're going to give you is like there's no magic fairy dust for these problems, right? A lot dealing with where we're at as a country and as a society right now is very difficult. It's very challenging, and a lot of what you'll hear me talking about today is the role that colleges and universities can play in trying to undo the Gordian knot that we've kind of tied ourselves into around through our politics. So rather than just give a straight up agenda, let me just say that the way this is organized today is sort of an argument for constructive dialogue. So we'll start with a definition. We'll talk a little bit about what it is when I say these two words, and then we'll talk 3 reasons for dialogue. And then we'll talk about it as a civic pedagogy, what it needs and what it looks like. And then we'll wrap up. Hopefully we'll wrap up before this phone alert is supposed to go off at 2:20 Eastern time that will make some awful screeching noise through our experiences. And we'll have a nice pause for that moment so we can all have that be minimalized. So let's start with a definition. What is constructive dialogue? There's a ton of different definitions out there for this type of work, and we have our own. I really like it. And I'm going to use it to kind of illustrate a couple things that are very important about constructive dialogue. This is a definition that has layers to it, I like to think. So constructive dialogue is a form of conversation where people with different perspectives try to understand each other without giving up their own beliefs in order to live, learn, and work together, right? So here's a couple things that I like about it. The first thing is that it says constructive dialogue is a form of conversation. When we talk about constructive dialogue, we are not talking about it as this is what every college classroom has to do all the time, nothing else. It is a form of conversation. There are other forms of conversation that are also important. We are institutions, or you all work at institutions of higher education. You are committed to pursuing truth, to discovering beauty, to uncovering new knowledge. Those things don't just happen through constructive dialogue. They happen through deliberation. They happen through debate. But those are different forms of conversation, right? Those involve things like persuasion and argument. But you don't see those words in this definition. That's because constructive dialogue really is not about persuasion at all. It is not a form of conversation in which our aim is try to persuade people about a certain view being right or better than another, to persuade someone that the view that they hold may be wrong, right? It's about trying to understand each other. And this other key thing, without giving up their own beliefs, right? So this is not encouraging, a goal of constructive dialogue is to not have everyone meet in the middle on some consensus point about what we should believe and why we should believe it. It's about trying to live with disagreement, about trying to work through disagreement, and use conflict and disagreement in productive ways rather than unproductive ways, right? So this goal of being able to live, learn, and work together, an emphasis perhaps in our particular context right now on learning together. So that's what we mean by constructive dialogue. And we the way that we think about it, that I think can be somewhat different than many other dialogue organizations, is that we focus on a set of mindsets and skills that people need to have so that they can be resilient in difficult conversations. So to contrast this, there's a lot of ways in which dialogue organizations will start with a protocol or a facilitator training or something like that, so that people can be led through a conversation and kind of guided to have a difficult conversation. But what we think is that even if you have a wonderful protocol, even if you have an amazing facilitator, there's still a chance that someone is going to say something that sends you into a fight, flight, or freeze moment where you're immediately reacting defensively, or you're shutting down from a conversation, or you're gearing up to fight them. And in those moments, we need options and skills. We need to be able to give people agency to know what to do in those moments. How do I act? How can I redirect the energy of the conversation away from an escalation into, putting one foot in front of the other and moving forward with the conversation? So we have 5 principles or 5 skills and mindsets of constructive dialogue. The first is let go of winning. Second is ask questions to understand. The third is share your story and invite others to do the same. The fourth is make yourself and others feel heard. And the fifth is find what's shared. So let's just quickly jump into these a little bit deeper. So the first is let go of winning. So oftentimes we approach conversations, especially on controversial or moral or things that we really do feel like we have skin in the game. We approach them like a zero-sum battle. One side has to win, one side has to lose. And this immediately sets up an adversarial dynamic that typically leads others to put up their defenses and become more adversarial themselves. So it minimizes the possibility of learning, and it often damages relationship. So what we encourage instead is trying to enter conversations with curiosity and a goal to understand. All right. And that's the first mindset that we really try to encourage with students. The second principle of constructive dialogue is ask questions to understand. So not all questions are created equal. Questions that are laced with judgment or that are aimed to trap somebody, where you already know the answer that you're trying to get from somebody, can undermine a conversation or dialogue. So teaching students how to ask questions of each other, I think, is even just a profound thing to do in the first place. I'm sure many of you have been in conversations where you hear students say things like, building on what so-and-so said, I think this, or I agree with what you said, but I think this. And what they're actually not doing is asking questions of each other and trying to find out more about what someone else thinks. They just link ideas together, and it has the feeling that it's a conversation, but it's not actually, there's not a deep level of exchange going on. So by teaching people how to ask questions to understand, we're trying to teach a new way to engage with each other. The third principle is share your story and invite others to do the same. Human beings are storytellers. It is just what we do. I like to give the example that when I have 2 young children, a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, I do not try to teach them chores by giving them empirical facts or the probabilities of what doing good chores will mean for you down the road in your life and everything. What I do is I tell them stories about children who don't do their chores usually, or children that do their chores. But we use stories all the time. We use them to educate people. We are constantly telling each other stories, whether it's just social gossip or whatever it is. But we tell stories all the time. And so in the context of a classroom, in the context of controversial issues, stories have the ability to move people from what you think to why you think something, right? And that's one of this thread that you'll hear me talk a lot about today. Um, one of the goals of constructive dialogue is to change the direction and energy of a conversation, to make it so that we're not just repeating the same things that we disagree about at each other, but we're trying to figure out where those beliefs come from, because that can actually give us something else to talk about and really explore where our disagreements lie and where they come from. And stories are key in that process. The fourth principle is make yourself and others feel heard. So if tensions rise during difficult conversations, it's important that you're able to share how you're feeling about it, right? And acknowledge the emotions you're hearing from others. So make yourself and others feel heard is our conflict resolution skill principle. It's really about being able to bring the emotional side of these conversations into the conversation without letting it become something that completely upends and disrupts the conversation. So how do we do this, and how do we make space for others to do the same thing? Finally, find what's shared. So a lot of people hear these words and they're like, oh, you're just trying to get us all to agree on something. That's not what this principle is about at all. It is very possible that after going through a session of constructive dialogue, of really trying to talk to people to try to understand, that maybe you do come to some shared understanding. But actually, what we really intend with this principle is to be able to focus on the things that we share with each other that transcend the differences that might be stoking a disagreement, right? So, oftentimes when people are in a disagreement, it's like, well, I'm seeing this person as Republican, or I'm seeing them as a Democrat, or I'm seeing them as this identity or that identity. But there's a lot more that we share at the same time that we hold these identities or these beliefs and ideologies that are different. And it's those things that can help us persist through disagreement to kind of continue working together. So finding practices that allow us to do that sort of work is really important for constructive dialogue. All right. So that's what we mean when we talk about constructive dialogue. So in a nutshell, it's this form of conversation that's built on understanding, that's meant to help us be able to live, learn, and work together, right? And it's really skills and mindset driven. And now I want to turn to 3 reasons for why we should be thinking about bringing dialogue into our classrooms and our campuses. And I'll give you 3 reasons. And I'm sorry, this is the philosopher side of me. I like giving clear reasons and numbers and lists to kind of make sure everything is as clear as possible. But why should we turn to constructive dialogue in the classroom? The 3 reasons I want to offer are: 1, preparation, right? And this has to do with the students that we're teaching. 2, pedagogy. I want us to think carefully and critically about what the common experience of the higher ed classroom is and what our goals for those spaces are. And then 3, polarization. And we'll think about some of the trends nationally that make this work very difficult. Leslie mentioned earlier this dialogue dilemma. So I think this is a really interesting place to start. So there's all these surveys. You can find them all over the place. And I think they generally tell a very similar story. And that story looks like this. Roughly 80 to 90% of students want to be able to talk and interact respectfully with people that are different from them, and they want their faculty and staff to be able to encourage and facilitate this. Yet, 60 to 70% of these same students agree that the climate on their campus prevents them from being able to do so, right? Or they are afraid to do so. These numbers have ticked up. What I think that this points to is a pedagogical challenge, right? So rather than viewing this as a crisis, I think we hear lots of people talking about, oh, students don't want to hear from each other. They just want to close each other out. They want to cancel each other. Well, that's because those are the skills that those are the behaviors that they've seen. They haven't seen otherwise. And if we think for a moment, right, about the students that we're teaching a group of students that for for pretty much their entire educational experience, they have been in a K through 12 system that has been shaped by standardized testing systems that prioritize right and wrong answers for everything. We have seen teachers that in K through 12 that don't have the same freedom of expression or academic freedom rights that faculty do. And so they're constrained much more on what they can teach and how they can teach it. And there's very few opportunities for most students in K through 12 spaces to be able to engage in questions that have a lot of gray area or that are complicated with multiple moral perspectives and sometimes conflicting moral perspectives. So students come onto a campus where a certain type of learning is expected, and they're not necessarily sure how they can go and do this and what it means for them to do it, and they don't necessarily have the skills to be able to do it, right? So rather than approach this as just a problem of students, it's a moment to teach them, right? So then let's move on here and think about the sort of stereotypical college classroom. And I say this with full knowledge that in many places there's been a lot of movement towards more engaged, more pedagogically sound teaching at the in higher ed. But the fact remains is that in many cases, systems like tenure reward research. They don't reward teaching as much. And so when we think about what's going on in the college classroom, there's still a real kind of foundational sense that what's supposed to happen here is that knowledge is being transmitted from a teacher to students, and students are supposed to just kind of respond and engage in deep questions. And so in some ways, the higher ed classroom has been resistant to some of the pedagogical changes that have been shifting K through 12 or have been popping up in ed schools and things like that. The other thing that's going on is that this mission of or this purpose of the college classroom is being one to sort of transmit, present new information, is also being shaped by AI, right? So, or being challenged by AI. Students are learning from YouTube. They are now leaning on things like ChatGPT. I'm sure this isn't the first place you've had conversations about these chatbots and the impact that they're having on what kind of assignments can I do? What's going, how are they shaping what my students are doing in class? So it's an important thing to think about. I really like this quote from Chris Deedy, who's a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who's been thinking about technology for a long time and has been thinking about AI since some of the earliest work that's come out on it. And he has this quote that I really like. The trick about AI is that to get it, we need to change what we're educating people for, because if you educate people for what AI does well, you're just preparing them to lose to AI. But if you educate them for what AI can't do, then you've got IA, intelligence augmentation, right? So I think this is a really useful way to understand what's going on with AI in the classroom and how that can shift the aims of the higher ed classroom, right? So if we are just presenting information, that's something that AI is very good at, more or less. But AI doesn't offer students problem-solving skills. It doesn't offer them decision-making skills. Those are things that we have to do, or you all have to do as faculty, right? How to sort through information, how to collaborate and work together and come to, whether it's agreement or work together on problem solving around big, difficult, thorny questions. That's the type of stuff that AI doesn't do and that higher ed classrooms can do. So I think it's another thing to think about when it comes to the classroom, right? And I think this is just another way of putting this point, right? Like, we don't necessarily teach students where to find information these days. We teach them how to critically sort through an overabundance and sometimes false information. We teach them what to do with all that information that is at their fingertips, right? So AI can't make decisions. It can't tell us what to do. We need to help students do that, right? Now, It's getting harder to do that because in this current moment, we face what we researchers are calling pernicious polarization. So Jennifer McCoy and her team through the Carnegie Center have defined pernicious polarization as kind of three things that are happening at the same time. Polarization is a trend, i.e. things are becoming more polarized. It's a state or an equilibrium, like we're just very polarized, there's X and Y. And it also, I think the worst thing in this moment is that it's a strategy, right? It's a winning political strategy where we think that the only way that the other side winning would be a catastrophe. And the only way that we can actually win is by rallying up those who think like us to beat the other side, right? And that's when polarization becomes really difficult. So when some of your comments were from earlier, navigating polarization in discussions and dialogues, thinking about the lack of positive or effective examples to show in our current political landscape. That's what's going on with polarization, right? So here's just a couple things that I think are helpful to kind of see the extent to where things are at. And I realize I'm speaking to faculty, so some of you might know this already, but I think it's just kind of useful. So this data is all taken from a More in Common survey conducted after the 2022 State of the Union address. So it's still relatively recent. So you can see that Americans are wary of each other, right? Americans across party and race overwhelmingly believe that the greatest threat to America is from within. And those numbers have ticked up considerably since 2010. It's strongest on the far wings, right? So in 2018, as you can see, the lighter shade here is the same question. You can see how the responses tick down in basically every single group to a greater extent in the wings here, right? So the people I agree with politically need to be willing to listen to others and compromise was at 60, 64%, and 53% in 2018. And by 2022, those numbers had ticked down. More in Common also gives us this idea of a perception gap. So this is this idea that you severely underestimate or overestimate what people believe on a sort of opposing group of people. So here, Democrats severely underestimate how much Republicans care about inflation and to a smaller extent, crime and immigration. And they overestimate some of the other talking points that we hear in the media about election fraud and taxes and things like that. And the same thing can be flipped around for Republicans thinking about Democrats. So what can dialogue do to address these things, and why should we be thinking about dialogue? This is the kind of culmination of this argument, right? One, dialogue can develop a set of transferable mindsets and skills. It can provide the things that students need to be successful learners in the higher ed classroom. It can encourage collaboration and problem solving that helps us deal with some of the issues that we might be feeling the pinch from the rise of things like ChatGPT. And three, it can help students start talking to each other again, and it gives us ways to circumvent that ecology that we're seeing in our polarized political and social contexts. All right, so let's talk a little bit about constructive dialogue as a civic pedagogy. And I promise we'll get to do some interactive stuff in a little bit. So how can we build constructive dialogue into our classrooms so that, we have a stable and coherent place for students to engage with each other, and that they know that this is a space that they can do that, especially in a context where, in all these other places, they see the worst of things, right? On social media, they see the worst of things. In our newspaper headlines, people like to talk about it as an attention economy, right? The way that you get people to click and read is by displaying the worst tendencies rather than the best tendencies. So how can we do that? There's two things I think we need to consider. One is a common foundation, and the second is how to build a culture around dialogue. And I'm going to give you some tools and advice around both of these things, and we'll take a quick experience of one way to start building a culture through teaching students skills. All right. So one way that we can really start to develop a foundation for constructive dialogue is by creating something that is at scale, that works, that a lot of students can experience, and that starts building those skills, or offering a language for talking about how do we talk to each other, that doesn't just sit in one classroom, but can live across a campus. We have a program that we call Perspectives. And we like to think of this as sort of a foundation for constructive dialogue, right? It aims to do three things. One, it introduces students to a common language around constructive dialogue. Two, it introduces students to the mindsets and skills that we talked about earlier. And three, it offers low-stake opportunities to practice constructive dialogue with peers. So it's three kind of pillars to this program. I'm not going to talk about the third pillar at all, but basically what we're looking at here is 6 lessons that really detail concrete skills for students to engage with each other across difference, and then uses what we call peer-to-peer conversation guides, which are 3 semi-formal conversations to practice the skills that you're learning about in these lessons, right? Just a quick peek into what some of the lessons are. So lesson 1 is called the divided mind. What we do here is, so CDI was founded in 2016 by Jonathan Haidt and Carolyn Mell, and it has its roots, unsurprisingly, in social and moral psychology. So we start with some ways that we know our brains process information, and we use that to kind of to explain to people, to students, how we're not even necessarily aware of the way that we're processing information and filtering that information, and how that can shape things like confirmation bias. So here we do start from this talking to students about automatic and controlled thinking, which is an example of dual process theory, right? So this is the idea, you might have heard it as fast and slow thinking, but the fact that we have different systems of processing information. And we introduced this metaphor of the elephant and the rider. And this is meant to give students a way of understanding how powerful our automatic processing system is compared to our controlled system. So we like to think of ourselves as rational beings, the rider, but actually, if you think about an elephant as a 3-ton animal, when it starts to go in one direction, a rider be damned, rider's not doing much. Our automatic thinking system is just a lot more powerful, and it's, you know, there's a bunch of story around that. What I always liked about this is that with students developing this common language around it, they will talk about how, you know, to a classmate, they'll say things like, "Hey, you know, this conversation is getting heated. I think your elephant's showing," right? So it becomes a way to like talk about ways that students are starting to dip into tension, and make it a way to surface those things and talk about them. And also we also introduce things like confirmation bias as useful tools to start understanding how we have a tendency to look for and confirm what we already know, and how difficult it can be to challenge what we hold to be true and valuable, right? And that's something that I think is exceedingly important for the higher ed classroom, where students come in and are exposed to things that can really challenge how they see and understand the world. Lesson 2 is about, it was called Us and Them. And the key concepts here, we're introducing them to the perception gap, which I mentioned earlier, as well as moral foundations theory. And this is an important way of responding to the perception gap, because the idea behind moral foundations theory, and believe me, I'm a philosopher, so I find psychological, sort of anthropological explanations of morality to be a little bit different than the way that I was trained to think of them. But the idea here is that, a lot like taste, we have a universal kind of awareness of these 6 buckets around these that are called moral foundations: care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And yet all of us form different sort of worldviews based on prioritizing and interpreting these foundations different. So some people, for example, let's not go there yet. So for example, some people might prioritize care and fairness. Some people might also prioritize sanctity and authority. And those lead to different worldviews. They lead to taking different positions on important moral topics, moral issues. And getting students to see that gives them a language to start digging down and talking about values, right? So again, if we're changing the direction and the focus of our conversations, and we're not just talking about what we disagree about, but why we disagree, we can start getting to the level of values. We can start really having different conversations and start to get a little bit more understanding and experience about why people come at the issue at different issues the way that they do. As I said before, the peer-to-peer conversations are really opportunities to practice embodying the skills and mindsets that they're learning in perspective. This goes back again, right? If we want students to be able to see learning spaces on campus as different than the spaces that they see off of campus, they need opportunities to practice those things, right? And these kind of conversations, these guided conversations can do that. I'm happy to talk more about these in the Q&A, but I'd like to keep moving so that we have time for our experience today. So building, the last thing I want to talk about here is, so we take this foundation. The next step is to build a culture of dialogue on top of it, right? Students don't, you can't just give them this language and say, hey, great, you're ready to go, do this. You need to be able to model it in your classrooms, on your campus. Students need to see that this is something that's valuable. And so to help faculty and staff think about how to do that, we've adopted what we call the PSI approach. The PSI approach stands for prepare, support, and intervene. And it also is directly related to this. For those of you that might think, teach or have experience thinking about in sort of science and physics, PSI does stand for pounds per square inch. And that is a important reference point here, because thinking about pressure and dialogue in terms of pressure is also important. So if you think about a combustion engine for a second, if it has no pressure, it is inert. Nothing is happening. If a dialogue has no pressure, it is also inert. Students might just be agreeing with each other. They're not digging down into disagreement. They're doing a bunch of those linked statements. They're not talking to each other, trying to avoid conflict as much as possible. If you have too much pressure, engines can implode and break down. Similarly, if you have too much pressure, your conversations break down in the classroom. We all know this because we are very worried about the third part of this, intervene, right? What happens when a student says something horrible to another student or to me? So we are very cognizant and aware of that. But what we really want to try to do is think about how do we build and create a healthy amount of pressure in the classroom where students feel that these conversations matter. They can feel some discomfort and disagreement with each other, but it's also not out of control, and they don't feel that as if they need to run out of the room, or that they are in a position where they are not safe, right? So that is the PSI approach in its relation to pressure. And the way we like to think about this is also this order of the words really matters, right? So a lot of us, when we think about dialogue, we go to thinking about what do I do in these worst case scenarios? But really what we want faculty and staff to start thinking about is how much can I do in the prepare and support stages? How can I prepare spaces to be ready for dialogue? And how can I support students to learn and practice the skills of dialogue so that when I do have to intervene, or when there are moments where tension is starting to spike, there's so much more that we can lean back on to kind of help us get through those moments, right? This is not to say that intervene doesn't matter or that it isn't a difficult thing to deal with. But what it is saying is that we can control a lot more the preparation and the support that we put in place. And that leads to more opportunities to deal with moments where we have to intervene. All right, so what I'd like to do for the next 15 to 20 minutes is I want to run through one of the how one way to teach dialogue skills and think about it in terms of where it might fit on your in your classroom or on your campus. As I said, listening for values is really important. Um, we think about back to the moral foundations we were talking about earlier. One of the most enduring findings of moral foundations theory is that people on the very left have a very different prioritize a set of values that are quite different from those on the right. So we know that people are coming in thinking about issues generally through different moral lenses. So if we can get down to that level, we can start to explore why our views are so different and where they're coming from. To do this, what I'd like everyone to do first is I'd like you to think of one thing that really grinds your gears, right? So everybody write it down. One thing that really grinds your gears, a pet peeve, a real annoyance. It can be something related to your work in higher ed. It can also be something that's a little bit more lighthearted for this example. We are going to get paired up with each other and talk about this, just so you know. The example that I often like to use for this is people that drive the speed limit in the left-hand lane, right? That just grinds my gears. If you're in the left-hand lane, you should be passing people, you should be driving faster than the speed limit, and you shouldn't be causing a backup by driving the same speed as somebody in the right lane. It just gets me, right? So that's my example. But I'd like everybody to think of one thing that really grinds your gears. And when you've got it, just throw up your thumbs up or something to let me know that you're ready to go forward. I'm seeing some thumbs. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do something that's called the complaints game. And this is an activity that's meant to help us learn to listen for values. So in a second, I'm going to put everybody into breakout rooms. For those of you that are teams that are all together, I'm just going to stick you in a breakout room by yourself, but you can pair off with people in real life to do this activity. So this is going to take about 5 to 7 minutes to complete. And here's what I'd like you to do in pairs. For the first minute, partner one is going to share that annoyance, and you're going to explain why. Just lay it out. Why does this thing really bother you? Okay. Person number two, you're going to listen that entire time they're talking. Don't ask any questions. When they're done, you're going to report back to that person the underlying values, commitments, motivations, or unmet needs that you heard. Okay. And then the first person will have a chance to respond again and say, hey, yeah, you kind of heard. I hadn't actually thought of it that way. Here's the way I was thinking of it, right? So we'll do that. So this should take about 2.5 minutes in total, and then we'll switch roles. So we're going to be in breakout rooms for about 5 to 6 minutes, and then we'll come back here and talk about what this was like. All right, so we're back. So let's just start and hear out. Feel free to share, and it's open. What was that like? Was it kind of comes out of the blue in the middle of this presentation? What did you notice about that example?
This is Carolyn. Honestly, I think I have a hard time not talking even for a minute. To listen. I mean, I had to like tell myself, don't say anything.
Right. Anybody else? What was it like to complain to somebody else for a whole minute and have them just listen to you? Did anybody's partner nail the values or commitments that you kind of underlie your pet peeve, or did they say something that made you think about, oh yeah, actually I'm really justified in how I feel about this, that I hadn't thought of before? Cathartic, very validating. I hear see in the chat, it's an accessible way to share our why. We don't feel this way for no reason. Did anybody feel the urge to jump right in and try to like problem solve the complaint that they were hearing? Or did you were you able to really focus in and try to do the responding back on the values and the underlying commitments or unmet needs? So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about this then. So let me explain why we do this sort of thing, right? So again, this is an activity that really can get people to push themselves to do things differently, right? Like if you are someone who, like Carolyn, so helpfully volunteered, wants to respond to somebody being forced to listen, right? This is a listening this is a listening exercise that gets us to start thinking about values, but it also helps us work on listening because it gives us a purpose, right? It's not just like listen carefully. You're trying to interpret and understand what this annoyance is, right? And root it in something meaningful for that person. So again, this is an activity that's meant to be short and sweet, that you can practice this basic and fundamental dialogue skill in, and that you can also start to use in ways to advance the content and learning of your own classroom, right? So it's an important dialogue skill, is to be able to start listening to somebody rather than speaking at them, right? But you can practice this skill in the context of whatever it is you teach, right? So you could take this activity, instead of having it be about a pet peeve or an annoyance after you've done this for the first time, you can repeat this activity later in the class as something about having a student or having pairs of students identify something that really bugged them about a reading that they just did, right? Maybe this is a reading that really gets, causes some friction with students. So have them talk about what it is and have their partner do the same sort of experience. Listen to that person's their critique and try to identify the values or the unmet needs or the commitments that are underlying their criticisms, right? So again, what we try to show with this sort of activity is that these basic dialogue skills can be taught and advanced through content in your course, and actually can become really interactive, fun ways to kind of talk about readings, to talk about difficult issues. And they start out in ways that can be pretty lighthearted and easy to get students comfortable with them and being able to practice them, right? Any other observations about this activity? Got a quiet group today. So I'm going to just open the floor for questions for a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some other options that we have available for you if any of this caught your fancy or you want to learn more about it. Any questions as far about what I've been talking about around dialogue, around the PSI approach, or anything like that? Feel free to fire away. You can put them in the chat, or you can pop your screen on and ask directly.
This is Carolyn. I teach entirely online, asynchronous. So that I'm always having to make the leap between having a dialogue, which in some ways is more controllable when you're all in the room. I mean, it is more controllable because people can write things in a discussion board or online, and then you're left with what's written there to respond to. I guess I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, yeah.
This is helpful.
So, right. So, you know, in that asynchronous space, you know, I think there are some unique challenges to it, but there are other things that you can do to help mitigate against some of the like, oh, it's just written there and now it stays there. I can't control what a student might be doing this at 1 a.m. in the morning versus being in my classroom at 11 a.m. and being face to face with everybody. There are all sorts of other activity. I wouldn't say activities. I would call them routines and practices that you can build into the culture of an online space, right? And they work. I tend to think that they work just as well in person as they do in online spaces. The sort of thing that the boundary or the obstacle that you're hopping over in the online space is that you are people are used to an online world where you click on you like things and dislike things and upvote and downvote, and you can say things anonymously, right? So you are in some ways dealing with that context in a way that in person doesn't. But I still think the same foundations as to how I would build an in-person space apply to how I would build an asynchronous space, right? So what does this mean? This means starting from things like a robust norming process, right? And I think maybe if you're doing it asynchronously, there's some ways that you have to translate a synchronous conversation about what is this learning space going to be like and what are our expectations for how we should treat each other into an asynchronous experience. But I think it's possible to do something like that, right?
I have rules for inclusive engagement. A kind of rule sounds terrible when I'm looking at it, but it's like a guideline that they're required to read before they can move forward in how we can discuss things with each other. To promote, to go back. I'm thinking intervention already. Like if I needed to say, this was not this, these are the rules for engagement, and remember that, kind of take them back to that if I needed to.
Yeah. I mean, a couple thoughts about that in particular. One is you might want to think about ways to engage students in the process of creating that list, even if it's like, I'm going to start off with, these are some things that I think are foundationally important for our space to be able to be a learning space. What I'd like you to do is comment, add some questions, things that you're not sure of, you want to understand more about. Is there anything that's missing from this list? And let students help create what that is, because when they have buy-in in it, then they become part of the maintenance of it, right? I think one of the big mistakes that we can make in a dialogic classroom is if you intend to be the sole protector of the space, and we don't empower students by giving them skills, by giving them mindsets to be able to engage in all the sort of like first level responses. You should be there for when things start to get beyond what they're capable of dealing with, but they need to also participate in upholding the norms of the classroom space. And they need to be able to kind of do that. I think they oftentimes need to feel like they own those things, right? So that's one thing that I would encourage, thinking about how to make your norms something that are co-created and that are resilient, right? So another mistake that I think we often make around norms is that we include them in a syllabus, or we do them on the first day, and then we don't ever come back to them, right? But having check-ins, where are we at? Are our norms changing, right? Norms are simply a tool to help a community have conversations together. And I've seen norms change in both ways. I've seen groups that start out with like, oh, we just need one norm, be nice to each other. And then what being nice or being respectful is looks very different to different people. And then you have to start fleshing that out. And then the norms list gets a little bit more complicated for a while, as people kind of address the nuances of this sort of very general principle that they started with. And I've also seen it where a group starts out with very particular principles and norms. And by the end of their time together, they're basically like, yeah, we have three things that matter to us. And we came to that because that's all we need by the end. Right. And that's the growth. That's when you can see the growth of a group coming together and being able to talk to each other. And again, I think asynchronous has a couple added difficulties, but I think the same sort of solutions need to be translated into that space, right? So check-ins after an asynchronous discussion board, how are our norms holding? Maybe there's specific norms that are going to be really important for an asynchronous space, right? Don't post anything that you couldn't say to somebody's face, right? Or that you couldn't, things like that to really help with some of that aspect of things. So Leslie asked, can I give an example of what make others feel heard might look like? So oftentimes, I think one of the better examples of this is if you're noticing that somebody else is retreating from a conversation, checking in with them, right? So, hey, what's going on? Is there something we need to talk about to be able to keep the conversation flowing? I'm seeing that your arms are crossed or that you're looking upset. Is there something that I said or did? Like, part of it is trying to invite that for others into the conversation and make space for it in the same way that we're trying to get students to be able to say things like, we oftentimes talk about it in what we call BIN framework: behaviors, impacts, and needs. So if somebody says something to you or says something in a conversation or does something in a conversation, you need to be able to name what happened, right? When I heard you say this, it made me feel X, and I need us to talk about that for us to move forward, right? So in some ways, what make others feel heard, it's kind of an awkward statement. We're still playing around with this idea because the idea is making others feel heard is kind of a weird set of words to put together. But the idea there is that we are trying to help make space to bring in the way in which people experience words that are said, right? Why do we think? Why is this? This is more just kind of me talking for a moment. But one of the ways that I think that the free speech and inclusion, that the tension there becomes reconciled, is by recognizing that you do have a freedom to say lots of things, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a consequence for the things that you say, right? So learning to experience what the consequence of holding some beliefs is and to see how students respond to that, right? And I think right now, one of the big problems is that we see students have very limited tools for how they respond to it. They cancel each other, right? It's like one of the things they do. But in a classroom, that's not very productive for learning. So how can we start to be in a space where you can have the ability to say things and recognize and respond to the consequences of those things that you say, right? And to me, that's a lot of where the space around free speech and inclusion, where we need to be thinking. Like, how do we create spaces where students can know that these things are both valuable, but know that together what it means is that speech has consequences to it, and we have to be able to respond to those things and try to keep and preserve a learning space as much as we can. Other thoughts, questions?
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll just quickly move on. The last thing I wanted to touch on, how can I learn more? If you're interested in some of the things we covered, you can check out Perspectives. Carolyn, Perspectives would work pretty well in an asynchronous context, just so you know. You could attend a PD session. Again, if you go to our website at constructivedialogue.org, there's information about upcoming PD sessions that we're offering. And you should always feel free to email us. So you can reach out to Courtney, who's here. She's the Director of Partnerships. Mike Wasserman is our VP of Growth and Development. You could always email me at jake@constructivedialogue.org. And Mylene Duong is our Senior Director of Research. We are always happy to get emails from people out in the field doing this work and hear about their experiences and think about how we can help. So thank you. Courtney, do you have anything you want to add?
We have a question in the chat.
Oh, we do. Great. How do you enact civic pedagogy in non-classroom settings? That's a great question. So I think in our experience as an organization, we have seen, say, Perspectives put in place in a number of different ways. We've seen it put in place in classrooms. We've also seen it put in place in first-year experiences through centers and the programming that they offer for students. We've seen it put in place through residence halls. So I think I tend to think of, I take a pretty expansive view of what civic pedagogy is. Insofar as, you know, civic means having to do with citizens and how we live together. So the sort of skills that we're putting in place here, I think matter not just for learning in a classroom, but for managing disagreements in resident halls, right? And there's a degree of transferability there, right? So when we're practicing how we negotiate conflict with people that we live with, the more that we can help students see that those are the same skills that we're engaging with at a civic level about broader civic issues, I think that you can start to see the ways in which all this stuff is kind of connected. And there are multiple realms to practice these things, right? So we can think of the skills that we want students to promote in a civic sense are skills that need to be practiced in multiple domains. So a civic pedagogy isn't just the voter registration or activism or anything like that. It stems from how do we begin to interact and deal with the people that live around us. Whether that be a roommate, whether that be college peers. So to me, I think that civic pedagogy really is something that is built across domains. And if we limit it to simply thinking about it as a set of civic activities that are focused on in civic centers, we're missing we're missing a key component of where students learn and practice these skills. Right. So.
And Jake, can you give a specific example of what that's looked like?
Yeah. I think this is a general example rather than a super specific one. But if you think about potentially some types of conflict between roommates that have to do with, you and I don't agree about what sort of flags you're hanging next to your bed on your side of the room, right? Learning how to negotiate that conflicts that come up at that level in a living space might not ever get picked up as a civic issue, but that's precisely what's driving one of the, either it's a symptom of or a driving force behind polarization, right? So the fact that we immediately want to push out somebody who thinks differently than us rather than try to figure out how is this somebody that I could actually, live and learn next to or along with them. Those are important civic skills that are kind of that could be masked or hidden in residential life, right? Stacy, is that help? Is there anything else I could add, or is there a follow up to that that question? Because it's a really good one. I mean, we work in classrooms, but we also find that student affairs and student focused admins on campus are really trying to figure out where to put these skills in place, and that classrooms are one other place where you can kind of continue to, you get an extra touch point to practice the set of skills. All right.
All
Any
right.
other questions?
Okay, seeing no more questions, I do want to again thank Jake and Courtney and the Constructive Dialogue Institute for joining us today. As a reminder, we will be sending out the recording. We're actually going to put it on our YouTube site, and I will send you that link. And again, thank you for being with us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Not showing up for me there. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Leslie Garvin. Not showing up for me there.